Good afternoon, everybody, or good evening, depending upon what part of the world you're in. This is Patrick Millikin from the Poison Pen Bookstore, and I'm here with my friend Stuart Neville. Hey, Stuart,
Hey,
always
Patrick, how are
great to
you?
see you. And we're going to be talking about all sorts of things. I have tons of questions, but of course, we're going to be talking about Stuart's absolutely terrifying new book, The House of Ashes. Uh, Finished it, and boy, it scared the hell out of me, Stuart.
Oh yeah.
I, yeah, just an amazing piece of work and completely different from anything you've done before in the
Hmm.
past. And so I have tons of things I want to ask you about that. And we'll also go into your lucrative side business as a luthier, or I'm sure your hobby as a luthier, building guitars.
Lucrative, I'm not sure is the right choice of word. Costly, I think, is the word you're actually looking for there.
Have you been buying all the StewMac gear, all the equipment?
I do. I shop with StewMac because they're the only place you can get a lot of the tools that you need, um, and they're not too expensive to ship over here. So yes, I have many StewMac. I probably even have some around my desk right now. StewMac bits and bobs.
Yeah, for those of you watching, StewMac is a company that manufactures gadgets for luthiers for working on guitars, specialty tools, and they're kind of the industry standard for buying those things. You
And
have
it's
quite a
expensive.
shop set
Yeah.
up too.
Sorry about it.
I said you have quite a little shop set up too, don't you?
Yeah, I mean it's actually just in the corner of my office. So if I move my camera, you can see I've actually got an awful lot of mess, and there's
Oh,
a guitar
wow.
next to it there, bits and bobs. Um, so I write and I fiddle at guitars in exactly the same room, which probably isn't the best idea ever. Not least of all because it generates quite a bit of dust. But yeah, it's I'm gearing up to setting up a proper workshop in my garage, but I need to clear all the rubbish out of it first. So yeah, that's my next step. I'm going to step up to a proper workshop and actually have a bandsaw and things like that, and actually start cutting up lumps of wood and making them from scratch if I can.
Now you've made a few guitars, and didn't you give Mark Billingham one recently? And
Yes. Yeah. It's. I don't think I have any pictures I can show you, but it's. I made a guitar for Mark's 60th birthday, which was at the start of the summer, and I had meant to be at the Harrogate Festival, Harrogate Dixon's Crime Festival, in mid-July, and I'd hoped to hand over to him in person. It was from me and the other members of the Fun Loving Crime Writers, the band I'm in with
right.
Van McDermott, and unfortunately I couldn't make it. Some health problems came up, and I couldn't get over to Harrogate. But the others presented it to him for me. It was a kind of a Cabronita Telecaster
Oh, wow.
thing,
Nice.
which I built for him. But yeah, that's become kind of a distraction for me this last. I think really over lockdown, it really kicked off,
Yeah.
um, and my wife encouraged me to get set up a proper. She was sick of me doing stuff on the kitchen table, so she encouraged me to get a proper bench and a place for my tools and things. That's kind of taken over a corner of my office here now. But yeah, it became kind of it's really become a thing since sort of late last year into this year. I built a few guitars. I built a bass for Luca Veste, the bassist in Fun Loving Crime Writers, and built a few for myself, including the Charvel Star replica you can see
Right.
in the corner there,
Right.
which I think
The
I'm
metal
most proud of.
guitar. I remember last time when we talked, I think Eddie Van Halen had just passed, and we were both talking about, my gosh, what a horrible loss that was, and a part of our youth was gone. And now
Yeah, just
Charlie Watts now.
yeah, Charlie Watson, and just by coincidence, I have the books that are currently my book pile sitting to hand because I know the question often comes up, but one of them is um, this new biography of Eddie Van Halen by Paul Brannigan it's called Eruption. I think in the UK it might be called Unchained. I think in the States. It's the same author. He wrote a very good Metallica biography as well. Yeah, very well known rock writer. That's there waiting to be read.
Right. Well, let's talk about the new book. There's so much to get into. Just as a kind of an introduction for people, the book is just now coming out here in the States, The House of Ashes. And it really, I read the book and it really is, completely different than anything you've done before. I saw, elements of Shirley Jackson, elements of The Handmaid's Tale, and all sorts of different things in the book. Can you just give a general introduction to the story, and then we'll get into it deeper. We'll talk about the characters.
Yeah, The House of Ashes was a long time in development. It was written over a few years. And it took me a long time to kind of get a handle on what it was about. But the gist of the story, it opens with a woman called Sarah Keane, who, an English woman, who is married to a man from Northern Ireland. And after what is kind of loosely described as a nervous breakdown that she suffered in England, he moves her back to his hometown, or close to his hometown, Northern Ireland. And she's only been there a few days. And it's just not quite comfortable in the house. Something's not quite right. For example, in the kitchen, on the stone flooring, this old farmhouse that they moved into and are renovating. These red stains keep appearing on the floor. No matter how many times she cleans them away, the next morning they'll be back.
Right.
And she's in the house maybe 3 or 4 days. At 6 a.m. in the morning, there's a frantic knocking at the door. And she goes to the door, and there's an elderly lady there, disheveled and bloody and confused, screaming at her, "Why are you in my house? Why are you in my house? Get out of my house. Where are the children?" And Sarah's husband rushes down the stairs, bundles this lady away back to the care facility that she'd wandered away from. And shaken by this, Sarah begins to dig into the history of the house. And the book then alternates between Sarah's story in the present day and the story of Mary, the woman who'd been at the door as a child 60 years ago in this same house, and the story of how she and 2 other women were held prisoner in the dugout basement of the house by a farmer and his 2 sons. And it tells these 2 parallel stories. And as the story goes on, the modern day story goes on, we start to see that the relationship between Sarah and her husband is not a healthy one. That his moving her to Northern Ireland away from her friends and family is part of him furthering his isolation of her. And it becomes clear that this is also an abusive relationship. So as these 2 women form a bond over these traumas that they have, Sarah starts finding the will to extricate herself from this marriage, and Mary also finds the will to actually finally tell her story of this secret really she's been keeping for 60 years about what happened in the house many years before. It's funny you should mention Shirley Jackson, because I would say We've Always Lived in the Castle is a very direct influence on this book, in the sense of the house being at the center of the story, and the house being a sort of a holder of secrets, and that the house itself has something kind of poisonous about it, if you'll pardon the pun. With the Shirley Jackson reference, but I always get the sense in We've Always Lived in the Castle, it's we know terrible things have happened, that the characters have done something and something's happened, but there's always a sense that's actually rooted in the house itself.
Yes.
There's something in the ground that the house is built on. It's in the brickwork, it's in the mortar,
right,
and the floorboards and the plaster. There's something inherently incorrect about the place. I think that's the thing I try to get across in this book, and that's very much coming from the Shirley Jackson book, and this idea of a secret that's been harbored for many years.
Now, as Mary tells her story, and as we gradually learn, we learn about this backstory that took place, over 60 years ago. The beginning opens with the fire, as you say, and then we go back in time 60 years, and gradually this story emerges. And also the story, which takes place, I believe it's in the late 50s, maybe early 60s time period, of course, is very important in Ireland and what's going on there during the Troubles. Can you talk a little bit, was the basic story built on any factual, or was it based on any true story, or was it completely out of your imagination?
When I started trying to write this book, it was way back in possibly 2016, I think. And I initially was looking at something that had happened not far from where I live, actually, not very long ago, with the Family Annihilation. And I kept thinking there's a story there to be told, but the more I looked at and the more I realized how recently this had happened and how there are relatives and family members around that would have been directly affected by this tragedy, and I couldn't, in good conscience, base something directly on this terrible incident because I think I thought it would be hurtful and insensitive of me to do that. But it was enough. There was enough of a seed there to kind of take it off in a different direction, that to remove it from that reality. And the idea that dual timeline came along fairly early on, but the original version of the book, the story that's set 60 years ago was always there. But when I first sent it out to my agent and to my UK publisher, sold in the UK on the basis it had an entirely different present day story. That was actually a continuation of the Strange Flanagan series, which was Those Left Behind and So Say the Fallen and those books.
Right.
And it was kind of centered around her investigating this arson attack on the house. And I was never quite happy with it. I was never quite satisfied with it. It never seemed to really kind of bond with the story set in the past. And I didn't actually have to. I mean, the book was sold. I didn't have to change anything other than basic editing. But I was just never quite, I knew it just wasn't quite what I wanted it to be. So I basically ditched that half of the book, and it was literally half the novel.
Wow.
And wrote an entirely new present day story that was more directly and closely intertwined with Mary's story from 60 years ago. And it's just one of those lessons learned that I really needed the story from 60 years ago to be in place before I could write the present day story, which is what I should have done at the start instead of trying to write them concurrently. And the end result, I hope, is something far more cohesive than what the original version was. And I may at some point dust off that story that was ditched and rejig it as maybe a standalone novella that acts as kind of a prequel to this book. Sometime, possibly, if I do another short story collection in the future, I might end up doing that. But yeah, it was a big undertaking, and I think I wrote the present day story, then rewrote that in about 6 or 7 weeks, I think. So fairly quickly, and but for me, it was worth the work and worth the time because I think the end result is stronger than what it would have been. Also, that the benefit also for readers that if they haven't read the Flanagan books, it is purely a standalone book now.
Right. Well, it's funny because we're a little hamstrung. How much do you actually feel comfortable talking about? Because we don't want to give too many spoilers away. But I mean, the present day story of Sarah. I think you said she was a social worker in London, and we learn that she's, recovering from some sort of breakdown, and this we get bits and pieces of her backstory. This kind of, she lives in Bath, England at the time, and she meets this sort of charming guy, named Damien, who spirits her back to Northern Ireland, where her father has bought this property on the cheap for pennies, and they're building this, what they think is going to be a dream house, or what she thinks is. But meanwhile, as you said at the beginning, we learn that he's sort of a classic abuser, manipulator type of personality. And he preys naturally on her vulnerabilities, and as a lot of abusers, manipulator types do, he successfully sort of extricates herself slowly but gradually from her friends and her support system. And can you talk, I mean, you must have had to do a little bit of research on that type of personality and those sort of dynamics. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, some of it was from talking to friends who'd been in situations, and actually talking to a couple of women writers. I'll not name because obviously it's a very personal issue for them, but through conversation, found out that they had been in those kinds of relationships, and they're able to tell me about the charm, the love bombing, the one person put it to me, this constant the constant shifting of balance beneath their feet, that the ground is always shifting beneath their feet. They're never sure where they stand.
Right.
And I tried to get that across of Sarah never being quite in balance in her own life and in herself, because Damon is constantly giving her that nudge away from herself, if that makes sense.
Absolutely.
And again, it's something that I have to use a bit of empathy with and kind of project with, but it's this idea of the abuser, as you said, preying on her because she's vulnerable, but him identifying the things, the facets of her personality that make her vulnerable and exploiting them.
Right.
And the way it plays out, and there's things that it's not a spoiler because it happens very early in the book. Like when Sarah finds out that this house actually does have a terrible history, she asks Damien about it, and he says, "Well, I told you about that." And she said, "No, you didn't." So he goes, "I did. Yeah, remember I told you." And that kind of gaslighting thing happens through where she's constantly missing information that her husband and his father know.
I'm glad you said that. I was going to ask you about the whole gaslighting aspect to it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that again, that's from talking to people that have been in that situation, and that it's that making her doubt herself constantly, right. Which, as I understand it, is a fairly consistent trait of that kind of relationship. I mean, the abusive relationship isn't a particularly physically abusive one; it's a mentally abusive one. It's about coercive control, and one of the key parts of that is gaslighting. This convincing the victim that they can't be sure of anything about themselves or surroundings or the situation or their own memory, and that constantly keeping them off balance. And that's, as you see, kind of that playing out through the book. And when Sarah is pushed to extremes within this, Damien turns that around on her and projects that it's her mental health that's the issue, not his action.
Right.
And pushing her to this, it's that constant shifting of the blame back onto her. And it's a great admiration for those women who have been brave enough to actually talk about it, because I can only imagine it's a very difficult thing to open up about. And I'm very grateful to those women who did talk to me about it, and share that experience, because I know it wasn't an easy thing to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and before too long, he takes control of the finances. Takes, you don't need to be bothered with that. I'll take care of that, and ultimately makes it so she's completely alone,
Mm-hmm.
and absolutely dependent upon him. That's a classic technique, isn't it?
Yeah. But it's that isolation in itself that then kind of brings her and Mary together then.
Right.
And which is, and that incident of Mary arriving at the door is what kind of shatters everything, and makes, or forces Sarah to stand back and actually look at her own life and the relationship and so on, and start to actually try to make changes.
Right.
And the more she does, the more Damien fights back, and therein lies the story.
Right, right. And then I was interested just, from a writerly structural standpoint, uh, the Sarah, the Sarah chapters are told in sort of a close third person. And then the
Yeah.
Mary chapters are absolutely in first person. Um, did that take, and then later on, we get some other characters' points of view sort of towards the last quarter, maybe third of the book. We
Yeah.
get some other characters, but before that, the story advances in those two perspectives, alternating, I think, unless I'm mistaken. But, did that take some tweaking around before you got that balance right or that rhythm right?
That's really what the rewriting the present day story was about, was getting the balance right. Because the core of the story, I mean, we're talking quite a bit about Sarah's story, but the core of the story is Mary's sort of experience from 60 years before. And that was the part of the story that worked from the start. But also Mary's voice was a very conscious decision, was to write her with an accent, which I've never done before. All my stories are set in Northern Ireland. I've always kept the accent fairly neutral. I've not really used too many too many colloquialisms or local sayings or expressions,
Right.
or vernacular. Whereas in this book, Mary does speak, and Mary's chapter she's speaking to. She's not writing it down. She's actually orally telling the story. And it's in her language, and there's Ulster Scots dialect threaded through it, which is a very specific dialect of this part of the world, and with different words like thran and cribbin and wishna, and this kind of thing. And it's written in that tongue, and I hopefully have managed to strike a balance that's easy enough to read, that isn't confusing to read, but there is this quite a heavy accent in those chapters from her point of view, and it's also it's a child's point of view. It's a child's point of view, but told as an adult as well. But everything's very much through the prism of her existence. And there are passages, and she has never, to Phil's sense, she has never left this farmhouse,
Right.
where the story is set. She's 11, 12 years old for the bulk of the story. And the limits of her world are this house and the yard behind it. And she's aware of the existence of things like cars and other countries, but they're very much abstract notions for her. There's a point where she imagines standing on the beach and being able to see Africa and France and America from the beach, because she has no concept of the globe, the world as a globe of places being thousands of miles away, because her world is so small.
Yeah, it's almost like Plato's cave in there.
Yeah, I mean, it goes. I mean, it probably has similar roots and inspiration to Room, which is based on the Austrian case, which I also heard about. Just that similar kind of setup to that. But also then, because everything is filtered through her very, very limited view of the world, it's also told in her language as well, and now she sees things.
Right.
And the only thing she knows about the outside world are what the other women that are there tell her about.
Well, speaking of, so how much how much can we really say about? Can we talk about the farmers themselves? How much do you feel comfortable talking about the backstory?
Do you know, I don't often volunteer to do this, because I don't really like it myself. Do you want me to read a couple of pages?
That would be wonderful.
Mary's first chapter. And I'm going to make a confession before we start. The very first line of this, I shamelessly stole from another local writer, a guy called Michael Hughes, wrote a book called Country, that was written in the same vernacular. On the end of the first chapter is the line, "Here now to tell you the rest." And Mary's first chapter in this point of view opens with the line, "Here now to tell you." I'll just read a couple of pages here, just to get the gist of it. "Here now to tell you. I always lived in the house. I never knew any different. Underneath in the room, down the stairs, in the dark. That's what I remember the most. We were told to put the lamps out. They locked the door at the top of the stairs, and that was that. Dark until they opened it again. I still don't like the dark. As far as I know, I was born there. Nobody ever told me any different, and I don't mind any different. From I was wee, that's all I remembered. Always. The one room under the house, and the rest of the place when it was light up. The only light down there was a couple of oil lamps they allowed us to have. It was always cold and wet. They made a floor out of wooden boards and a ceiling with posts to hold it up. The floor was always damp. Sometimes if it rained hard outside, mucky water would come up through the cracks. I don't mind what age I was the first time they let me up the stairs by my own self. 5 maybe, or 6. Old enough that I could do a lot of wee things about the place. Sweeping up the floors or dunging out the ashes from the fireplaces. Mummy Norton told me what to do. Says she, when the daddies is around, you don't look at them. Just you get on with your work. Just you pretend you aren't there, and they'll not bother with you. Unless they do bother with you. Then you be polite and don't give them any cheek. So that's what I did. I just beat on with what I had to do. And if Daddy George or Daddy Ivan came in, I just put my head down and said nothing. And that wasn't hard to do either. I was wild to fear to them. They weren't still about giving beatings them boys. Many times Mummy Nori and Mummy Joy would have a black eye or a sore back from a kicking. Daddy Tom was the worst of them. He was a cribadile skitter, so he was. He'd slap you as soon as look at you. And them big hands of his. If he hit you, you knew you were hit. So that maybe gives a sense of Mary's voice and a little glimpse of her world.
Right.
As the story starts. That's right. That's really her first chapter. So no spoilers.
Right. So we learn that these three, a father and essentially his 2 sons,
Yeah.
They're farmers on this sort of remote farmhouse in whereabouts exactly is it, and where you have it set in the book? You don't exactly place it, right?
Yeah, it's set in close to a fictional village called Morganstown that first appeared in So Say the Fallen, I think. But that area is kind of around an area called Waringstown, Dollingstown. Kind of a bit northwest of where I live. It's kind of mixture of small towns and rural area, kind of cattle farming and orchards and market towns. Yeah, I can't think of an American comparison, but
seems like a very beautiful, kind of idyllic part of the world.
It would have been for people under normal circumstances in those times, very, very green, very idyllic, cattle in the fields and birds sitting in the trees kind of thing. But as with any beautiful exterior, there's often a dark interior.
Right. And so we learn, I'm being very careful on what I say. There are similarities between the sort of father-son relationship, if you will, in Sarah's story, and we learn a little bit about her father, Francie.
Damien's father.
Excuse me. Damien's father. Yes, of course.
Her father-in-law. Yeah.
Yeah, and that background, that father-son, and can you talk a little bit about that? That's a huge part of Damien's character and what comes through in this book.
Yeah, I mean, Damien is a domineering character with Sarah, but in turn, Damien's father, Francie, is very domineering with him. And he has a history. The book doesn't go into too much, but we learn that his father was a prominent and powerful paramilitary figure during the Troubles, and was imprisoned. And during the early release of prisoners in the early 2000s, he was released and somehow became a property magnate, basically, as many people did around that time, and has become very wealthy. And Damien, his son, has become well educated as an architect by trade and has come back to Northern Ireland to work for his father. But that dynamic that we see of kind of Francie's dominance over his son, we see mirrored 60 years ago of, as he's called, Daddy Ivan in the house, the patriarch of the house, his dominance over Tam and George, his two sons, are middle-aged brothers, and their in turn their dominance over the women held captive in the house. Um, yeah, so there is. To be honest, I haven't actually thought about that an awful lot, but yeah, there is a kind of a study of how that kind of misogyny can be sort of passed down through generations.
Right. And, of course, since the daddy Ivan, he's the patriarch, and he's bad, violent. But and then Daddy Tam, as you call him in the book. I'm just briefly bringing up these three guys, and they each have distinct sort of personalities. They're all violent men. Daddy George is the one that has just a little teeny bit of a heart, as it plays out in the book. And as you said, these women, these three men, very deliberately prey on vulnerable women, women who are, runaways, women who are sort of cast aside. There's several different types that they prey on. I don't really have a question there, but it's just more of a.
One point I'd like to make on that, though, is although the story set 60 years ago is about this kind of abusive household, I should point out that the book never dwells on or really delves into the abuse in itself. That's one thing I was very careful not to do. I didn't want to be salacious about what the women in the house have suffered and continue to suffer. I didn't want that to be what the reader's eye would be focused on. And the chapters from Mary's point of view and from the other women's point of view are more about their relationships with each other and the bonds they have with each other and the conflicts they have with each other and their own hopes and dreams and memories and their own battle to get out of that situation.
Right.
It's very much following that rather than focusing on the sufferance of being there. If that makes sense. It's because it wasn't something. It's not something I mean, this book is unusual for me because something I've never really wanted to look at as a writer, and frankly as a reader, is sexual violence and specifically sexual violence against women. It's not something I really want to spend any time with. In this story, we know that is a reality and that it has happened, but it's never something that's sort of front of stage. It's always something that we know is in the background, and the story is more concerned about how these women are surviving and living as best they can in these circumstances, rather than what the terrible things that we know they have to be going through.
Right. And then we learn gradually that there's been others in the past that have come and gone. And then, you drop in this character named Esther Mooney into the mix, who's one of these girls. And I believe, just gradually, like a lot of people, she's, she's orphaned essentially when her parents die. And she's lured out to this house. And she's dropped into the mix, and she becomes kind of a sister to, I believe she's 10 years old at the time, roughly, Mary, and sort of a tutor to the ways of the outside world.
Yeah, we meet Esther about a third of the way into the book. Now, Esther is she's from a wealthy family, or was a wealthy family. Her father was a linen trader, but he basically goes bankrupt and commits suicide when she's 13 or 14. Her mother dies from cancer a couple of years later, basically leaving her an orphan, with no money, no protection from the state, and she's basically left on her, and she's in this desperate situation, and bumps into this kind and friendly man in a cafe who lives on this farm out in the country, and him and his brother and his father, and they can't manage the house at all. They can't boil an egg between them. Would she come and be their housekeeper? And this is how she's lured into this situation. But we learn then very quickly that Esther is made of pretty hard stuff when it comes to it. And she then is the catalyst for everything that happens after that. Her arrival basically breaks this this kind of shell that everybody's been living inside.
Right.
And particularly, yes, there's Mary's logic as a child is that the two older women are her mummies, so Esther must be her sister, and that's the basis that their relationship forms on. But again, I think that's the thrust for me of what the story set in the past is. It is about the relationships between these women, between Mary and the other women, and yes, the plot is driven by the desperation of the situation. But for me, what was more interesting to explore was how these women actually live together in these circumstances.
How did you come up with Mummy Joy and Mummy Noreen? You know, they're both different kind of survivors.
Yeah, I mean, they're both kind of extrapolations from the basic characters I work from. But Noreen, Mummy Noreen is she's the one that's stubborn and will survive no matter what. And she's the one that's really kept the others alive all this time. And because human beings are complicated things, Joy, the other woman in the house, hates her for it, but also loves her for it. You know, it's a complicated, complex dynamic they have between them, and this kind of almost love-hate thing between Joy and Noreen, where Joy has wanted to, in the past, take the easy way out, as it were, and Noreen is the one who stopped her. But Noreen has this kind of stubborn will to keep going, to outlast the men and survive this, whereas Joy is kind of being more buffeted along by it. And then Mary is really what keeps Joy going as well, is because, as we learn fairly on, I don't think it's a spoiler, that Joy is Mary's natural mother, even though Mary's never told that. And it's that bond between Joy and Mary that gets explored as well. You know, how a mother can be with her daughter, even though she's not allowed to tell her she's her daughter, and so on. Yeah. So that for me, that part of the book is what I find interesting, is those dynamics between the women, and that are shaped by their characters, and the drive to keep going and not to be destroyed in this situation.
Right. And then you have we haven't talked about, there's the character, the electrician named Antonio, and he seemed to be like an interesting character. And you talk a little bit about the Italian, you know, what Italians coming to Northern Ireland and all of that. Talk a little bit about Antonio and his role in the book.
Yeah.
Or Tony.
He's only called Antonio by his mother when she's angry at him. In the story. He's an electrician, a spark, who's working on the house. But he's kind of the one contact that Sarah has, the one man in her life who has any kind of decency about him. And although he doesn't explicitly say it, you can see that he sees some of the reality of her situation and tries to help her. But he's from a very different kind of background. Well, actually, he's from a very similar background to what Damien is, except Damien's family went on and got money, whereas Tony's very much working class. You know, lives in a council house with his mother. He has fish fingers and chips for his tea. You know, he's not an educated man, but he's honest and he's decent, and it gives Sarah somebody to cling to, and there's an attraction between them. That's clear from the start, but you just can't be acted on in the circumstances. But he's by no means a white knight, and he's not there to rescue anybody, but he's somebody to help Sarah kind of navigate her situation, I think.
And he also is you know, aware of what happened in the past. He has that knowledge, and he's able to.
He has a sort of vague idea of what went on 60 years ago, enough to start Sarah looking in the right direction.
Right. And this, I was just going to say, and, as he's working on the house, he just has, and we won't go into it too much, but this house is wonderful. I mean, it has a lot of bad mojo, and as he's working on the house, he picks up on it.
Yeah, it comes back to the always live in the castle thing, the idea of the house itself having some malevolence about it, whether it's the house or whether it's the ground it's built on, whatever it is. And he senses it when he's there, and he talks about other workmen being on site and not being happy with the place either. Which actually kind of based on there's an actual castle not far from where I live that was renovated into apartments probably about 15 years ago, I think now. And there were all sorts of stories coming from like the electricians and the plasterers who are working in the basement rooms and so on in this castle, of sudden changes of temperature and shadows shifting in the corners and this kind of thing.
Right.
Right. I'm not a superstitious person. I always take that with a pinch of salt, but yeah, some of that might have fed its way into this story as well. And I guess that's the point we haven't discussed. Really, this is also partly a ghost story.
I was about to say it has a lot of the Gothic in it.
Yeah, and again, I think that's, well, it's probably my Stephen King influence, but I'd say the Shirley Jackson influence as well. There's that, there is a strong sense of the other in it.
Yep.
Oh, things that just aren't quite right. And it's a bit like Ghost of Belfast. And the Ghost of Belfast, I was very careful throughout that book to allow these manifestations that appear to Jerry Fagan in the Ghost of Belfast, allow the reader to make up their own mind whether those are psychological figments of their imagination or if they're actual spiritual, supernatural manifestations. And likewise, House of Ashes, we are aware of other presences in the house, but I would allow the reader to make up their own mind whether those are in the minds of the characters or actually in the house in reality.
Right.
Maybe it makes me lazy. I like to let the reader do a bit of the work.
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny, I didn't make that parallel, but of course, yes, with the Ghost of Belfast. Yeah, I can definitely see that connection. I think it's fascinating too, this notion, we're just talking about it. I can't remember who it was with, but we were talking about the imprint, of the past, and you think about places where a lot of violence or tumultuous events have occurred in the past, and the imprint that it leaves. You go to Gettysburg, or you go to the French countryside and the trenches, or places like that. Here in Arizona, there are a number of towns. I'm thinking of there's a little town called Bisbee, a mining town where a bunch of violence has occurred, labor violence, and I always get kind of a weird sense there when I go.
Yeah, I mean, again, and I'm not a superstitious person at all. Yet I've always been interested in this idea of kind of the unseen, or things that are just sort of beyond the periphery of our vision,
Right.
I mean, a lot of that is part of my reading. I mean, I'm the first adult writer I read was Stephen King. I read The Shining, I think, when I was 12. Hi, Barbara.
Stuart, I just wanted to pop in and say hi. I'm sorry I'm late. I'm on puppy patrol. They pee faster than I can move. So anyway, I was out cleaning them up, but I wanted to tell you how much I enjoyed.
Thank you.
The House of Ashes, wonderful book. You are such a terrific author. And you recently, we've made the acquaintance of Catherine Ryan Howard.
Yes.
Yep. And she and Derva McTurlin are going to do an event for us. I think it's Friday, isn't it, Patrick?
Is it this Friday?
I think so. And we're talking about Irish crime, but Derva, as you might know, lives in Perth, Australia. and Catherine's in Dublin, and we're in the middle. So it's a real time span to try to do that. But I would love sometime to get a number of you together and just talk about Irish crime rather than, or just Irish writers. Doesn't have to be Irish crime, but why not?
Yeah, that'd be good. I mean, I haven't read Catherine's book, but 56 Days, but I've seen an awful lot of buzz about it. So
It's
I'm
very
anxious to
good.
check it out.
It is a pandemic novel that only works, would only work in a pandemic, but it's not about the pandemic.
Yeah.
It's merely the circumstance that forces these two people to move in together. And it's only as you read the whole book that you work out who was the dead body in the prologue and why. I mean, it's a very good book. It's not noir. And it's not one of these trust no one either. It's I don't even know how I'd describe it. Patrick, did you have a chance to read it?
I have not. No, I'd like to.
Yeah, I think I brought you my advanced reading copy. But anyway, she's an author reasonably new to us. So we're very happy to have met her. But, I think it would be fun if we could organize something. Might be in the new year because everybody is so busy.
Yeah. Well, I would love to.
Right.
Get Adrian involved.
Yeah, we could get Adrian together and Catherine and you and John Connolly, even though he's not really writing Irish, but it's hard to ignore him.
So John, are you aware of that John has an anthology on the way? An anthology of Irish speculative fiction.
I'm not. Could you email Patrick some details?
Yeah, I'm not sure who's publishing it, but it's collected stories of sort of Gothic stories from Irish literature, and I think the thesis of the book is that Irish literature is very much known for Joyce and this kind of literary tradition, but there's this really strong tradition of a speculative and Gothic fiction that he's then drawn this anthology from. So I think it looks very, very interesting. So
Wonderful. Yeah, he does like doing stories and anthologies. I loved his book about Irish folk tales, or I can't remember the name of it. Maybe Patrick does, but I mean, that was a wonderful collection.
John is he's quite academic in the whole thing. For someone who's not an academic, he's actually very academic. But yeah, no, it looks to be a very interesting book.
Right. Well, I don't think we could probably get Ken Bruin to cooperate, but then again, maybe we could. We do.
Has Ken never cooperated with anybody?
He has a new book out this month, in point of fact.
Does he?
Yeah, right. Galway, which also is what Dervla writes about, and which I have visited. Patrick, you've been to Galway too, haven't you?
I sure have, yeah.
Yeah, the West Coast, and there's an Irish actor. He's from Northern Ireland, and he's starring in a British crime drama. I'm trying to think what it is. He's the head of the.
Cillian Murphy.
No, it'll come to me. But anyway, he's done there's a video thing, and he's touring Western Ireland, and he starts at the farthest point southwest, which is a bridge that's been rebuilt. And then he goes all the way up the coast, and he comes around past the Giant's Causeway and everything and back down, because he's Northern Irish, and back down to, I don't think it's Belfast. I think he stops in the mountains of Mourne or someplace like that. Anyway, it's a wonderful, I was going to recommend it to Patrick. We watched it the other night because we've done that swing on a expedition ship where we plunged into rafts every day and, arrived soaking wet and freezing at like the Aran Islands, which I thought were gorgeous.
Very good. If you're interested in Irish writers, one book, I mean, there's lots of books I can recommend, but a couple, I don't know what their publication status is in the States, but The Last Crossing by Brian Mcgilliway recently just won the Theaksons Award.
Right.
In the UK, it's a really, really good novel. It's worth seeking out. And Who Took Eden Mulligan by Sharon Dempsey. Sorry?
Is that set in Sligo? I know some of his have been up in that area anyway.
A lot of it's set in kind of the border areas of between County Derry and across to Donegal. Sort of
we import Brian's books, Stuart, because I don't think he has an American publisher at the moment, but we import his books from London. I think he's a wonderful writer. I still remember his first book. Do you remember it, Patrick?
I do, yeah.
Yeah, it was really excellent. I'm sorry that he hasn't really gained more of a US audience, but yeah, we should definitely.
This
include
award
him.
might help. Yeah, that's
Yeah,
great.
no, I
Yeah.
think you should. I think The Last Crossing is very, very. I think it's a terrific book, and yeah, it deserves to get a readership in America if it can. I think,
Wonderful.
and,
Well, listen, I'll get out of the way. I just wanted to say hi, and how nice it is to see you. I hope that one day you'll be able to come back to Scottsdale in person.
so do I. I always love visiting Scottsdale. I hope we get back soon.
Okay, great. I'll let you guys finish up then and see if I can exit myself. I think this is me. Yep, there I go. Bye.
Bye bye, Barbara.
Wow. Well, is Owen Mcnamee still around? Is he still
Yeah,
alive?
I'm trying to think what he had a book. I think does he have a book on the way? I think at the minute. I would need to. Something tells me he has a book either recently out or about to come out. But yeah, Owen's still working away. Still, I for my money, the best writer out of all of us in the Irish crime scene.
Mcnamee?
Yeah, I think just in terms of prose and plotting, I think he is I guess a writer's writer. I feel like he's one of those writers I read that I can I read it and I think I can't do that. There's an ability, a skill there beyond what I can do. I think he is the best of us.
Yeah, I like his stuff a lot. Not very well known in this country. I think he wrote Resurrection Men.
Resurrection, and I think it's
And the book about Princess Diana too.
yeah, I have a terrible memory for this kind of thing. It's either Orchid Blue or Blue Tango, Orchid Blue. He's a trilogy of books set in kind of 1950s Northern Ireland about miscarriages of justice that are very good, and he was Booker nominated, I think, for one of them. But yeah, well worth seeking out if you want, if you like Irish crime fiction.
Just looking at some of the questions that are coming in here. Robert has one. He asks, he said, I read an ARC of The House of Ashes, and I also recently read The Last Thing to Burn by Will Dean, which also deals with the subject of women being held prisoners. His book is more explicit than his House of Ashes. I've been in a discussion of Dean's book, and many people do not want to read it because of the dark subject matter. What can you say to those readers who are reluctant to read a book like this?
Well, like I said earlier, I can't speak for Will's book. Will's books, I remember seeing an early blurb for Will's book and thinking, oh God, he's written the same book as me. But it's actually a very different book. His book is about, I think she's Vietnamese, a woman who's trafficked, becomes the wife of a farmer. I use the wife in quotes there.
I don't know the book. I'm going to have to look it up.
Yeah, no, it did very well here. It was a very good book. The thing with the House of Ashes, like I said earlier, I'm not interested in dwelling on suffering.
Yeah.
In the book is more about the relationships between the characters. Whether that's the present day story where the relationship between Damien and Sarah changes and reaches a crisis point, the relationship between Sarah and Tony, the relationship between Damien and his father. Then in the story set 60 years ago, the relationship between not just the women, but also the relationship between the three men in the house as well, which is fractious.
Yes.
George is kind of bullied by Tam, and they're both bullied by their father. And I think the book is more about relationships between the characters than anything else. And there is some violence that's kind of short and sharp violence towards the end of the book. Through the rest of the book, we know that it's going on. We know there's a threat of it. We know there is. Everybody's lives are defined by it, but the kind of lens of the story is not focused on that. It's focused on the characters themselves and their relationships with each other and their kind of battle to get through the thing.
Right, and then in the contemporary story, it was Sarah and Damien. There's no, as you say, it's mental, psychological
Yeah.
abuse for the most part. But there is a palpable sense with Damien, a palpable sense of violence and a sense of, not that it's expressed, but very threatening. The anger kind of bubbles up, and you see, it's like he pulls off the mask for a second, and you see what he's trying to keep contained.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing about abusive men, is that very often to the outside world they're really charming, nice men. How many times we heard that story where there's been a domestic murder, and the neighbors are shocked because he's such a nice man. It's not an uncommon pattern of presenting as being charming and persuasive and sweet, but in reality there's that kind of rotten core there that comes with that kind of narcissism that abusers have. And as a local expression we have here, he didn't pick it up off the ground. It's clear when you meet his father where that comes from.
The apple didn't fall far from the tree, as we say here. Here's a good question. CJ asks, not CJ Box, CJ asks, how much of the rewrite focus on Sarah's mental health was influenced by the stories we hear about mental health, especially domestic abuse from the lockdown experiences? That's an interesting question.
I think there has, sometimes things influence the story, whether you're conscious of them or not. Both those stories, the stories from 60 years ago and the stories set in present day, are both very much pressure cooker kind of situations, also both very much about isolation. And it didn't occur to me after the book was written, and it certainly wasn't intentional, that it could be taken as an allegory for lockdown, this idea. I don't know what it was like in Arizona, but certainly for us here, we basically didn't leave the house for a year pretty much, or we were homeschooling the kids, and most shops were closed. We got our groceries brought out to the trunk of the car at a collection point, that kind of thing. So there's very much, everybody had to kind of go into their family bubbles. For us that was okay. Me and my little boys had to watch movies all the time. For us it was actually quite a bonding thing in a lot of ways with our kids. But I know for some families, I don't know what the stats are, but I believe domestic abuse issues and complaints to police escalated quite a lot over lockdown because of that, people being sort of forced together. Whether or not that was actually healthy. And I think there were a lot of concerns particularly for children who were in vulnerable homes, who were being isolated in families that maybe weren't the best places for them, unfortunately. So whether I was conscious of it or not, because that part, the present day story was written, yes, during lockdown. And I guess that must have been influenced it, whether I was aware of it or not.
Yeah. It's funny. It was a pressure cooker kind of environment, and you add it to a situation that's already kind of volatile. You add one more stressor into the mix like that, and it could reach a tipping point. Well, we should probably wrap it up, but there are a few last things I'd like to ask you. You mentioned that originally, and this fascinates me, originally you had conceived of this book as a Serena Flanagan novel. And now that I think about it, I can see how that could have worked. But I'm so glad you went this way. This is a brilliant novel.
Thank you.
But I love Serena. Any chance of her coming back?
I have no specific plans at the moment, but never say never. The book I'm writing now is a standalone as well, and probably the next will be a standalone, but I wouldn't rule out that she might come back at some point. As I say, there could be a novella to be had out of what was excised from this book. And And I think the issue with that being a Flanagan book was that it wasn't a Flanagan book, if that makes sense. It was very much Mary's story.
Right.
And Flanagan was there as kind of a secondary character to it, which part of the reason why I felt it didn't quite work. It wasn't quite doing her justice as a character. But yeah, there could well be something in the future. I wouldn't rule it out.
Was the House of Ashes your original title?
No, oh boy, we had some wrangling over the title. I initially, with the very, when I first started writing, it was called The Children of the Ashes. But it never, once the book was actually finished, particularly with the rewrite, it never didn't quite sit properly. And I went back and forth quite a lot with my publishers in the States and the UK and just trying to settle on something. And the House of Ashes was eventually where we wound up, in that it's just crimey enough to be crimey, just spooky enough to be spooky. You know, it was just, we thought that was the sweet spot.
It does double duty, triple duty as a title,
Yes.
which is what you want, right?
Yeah, indeed.
Yeah.
Indeed.
Anything else going on? Any TV or film stuff happening at the moment?
Not at the minute. Everything's, I think things are still in flux because of the pandemic and so on. There's always somebody sniffing around the books in terms of film and TV. Nothing, I don't ever get excited about any of that stuff because I have no control over it. I'll happily accept a check when someone writes me one, but it's not something I'm sort of concerning myself over. I'm really focused on trying to get of the next book. I'm trying to get it finished. It's proven difficult. It's been difficult over lockdown to write, to be honest, because we've been homeschooling and so on. And we had a couple of lockdowns. The last lockdown, my wife went back to work and I had the kids at home, so I was doing the homeschooling. And by the time I sat for a day trying to remember how to do maths and all these things that I thought were long, many years behind me, my brain really wasn't in the right place for writing by the time I was done with that. So that's kind of slowed everything down. And then he's okay with our little boy had a bad accident at the start of the summer. So a lot of back and forth to hospital and surgery and so on with that. I was ill, and just everything is one of those. This year's been one of those years where everything has kind of got in the way of writing. So I'm getting stuck in now, and that's my focus now, is to get this bloody book written, get it done, get it away.
Is there anything you can tell us about the book, or would you rather not?
Well, yeah, it's this one's set in 1945. And it opens with a man coming back to Northern Ireland, to rural Northern Ireland from the war. And he's been badly injured, has lost an eye and has scarring and so on, and is physically very much marked by the war that he's come home from. But he comes home to this small mill village that he's from. And he's been absent from a couple of years comes home to his wife to find the village has changed, and that there's always been a religious community, a fairly religious community, but a new preacher has come in and has very much bonded the village around his gospel hall, the church, and this kind of twisted idea of community that our protagonist comes back to and finds himself at odds with. And really the story is about how he and this preacher wind up on a collision course for the heart of this village that he's from. So that is what I'm working on.
Sounds fantastic. Wow.
So, well, if I can get it finished.
Well, Stuart, thank you so much. It's been a treat to talk with you as always.
My pleasure. Thank you.
This is the book we've been talking about, The House of Ashes, and we have Stuart was kind enough to sign some book plates for us, and so our copies come with the signed book plate. Thanks so much, Stuart, and look forward to talking with you again soon.
Thank you, and hopefully in person next time.
That'd be great.
Yeah.
All right. Cheers, everybody. Thanks for watching.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Hello. We hope you're enjoying our programs and podcasts with authors. We'd like to expand them, and your help would be appreciated. Please make a donation at poisonedpenfoundation.org. 100% of the proceeds will go to help connect authors with readers in this difficult time. Thank you.